Good afternoon. I'm Beth Purvis. I am the director of the Educating Character Initiative, the program for leadership and character at Wake Forest. I'm welcome to session 5 in the Educating Character Initiative webinar series. We are thrilled to have you here. If you are new to our community, I encourage you to register for the ECI so that you don't miss any of our announcements or grant announcements and other things. As you may know, we have an exciting panel today, but as you may know, educating character across differences is also the focus of our conference to be held at Wake Forest from December 5th through December 7th, 2024. Please save that date. And as importantly, the call for papers and workshops for the upcoming conference is open until June 20th. So please consider a submission. If you look at the chat, a link to our registration for the ECI community, a link to our website, and a save the date for the upcoming conference are all connected there. As I also will say as a bit of housekeeping, as you're listening to our panelists, I encourage you to submit questions through the webinar portal as soon as you think of them. That way, when their presentations are completed, we can jump right into the questions. I'll do my best to get to as many questions as we can before our hour is over. I also hope that each of you had time to read about our panelists online before joining us today. Given that we only have an hour together, I want to move as quickly as possible to hearing from our guests. So today you will have the great pleasure of hearing from Ashley Floyd Kuntz, who's an assistant professor of higher education at Florida International University, Chrystal Johnson, an associate professor of social studies education at Purdue University, and Robyn Ilten-Gee, assistant professor, faculty of education at Fraser University. You all may recognize these three names together because they presented on a similar topic almost 2 years ago at the 2022 Program for Leadership and Character Conference that was held at Wake Forest. So thank you again to our panelists for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Ashley to begin.
Thank you so much, Beth. And thank you to everyone for being here today. I'm so delighted to be with you and to be back with this group of colleagues on a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And as I understand it, my goal here is to set sort of a theoretical and conceptual foundation, and then my colleagues are going to be walking you through some of the work that they're doing on their campuses and in their research and in their communities. So the focus of my talk today will be missed opportunities for educating character across differences. And I'm going to talk with you about a specific context in which I think that we in higher education miss opportunities for this sort of work. So I want to take you way back in time to when colleges were on the front pages of almost every newspaper, and we were making headlines every day for campus and political unrest, for protests on campus. I'm not talking about last week or even yesterday. I'm talking about 2017. And in 2017, college campuses were experiencing repeated clashes over controversial speakers. And what kept happening is that these controversial speakers would try to speak, and then students would shout them down or protest, and counter protesters would come along and they would stoke the fire, and police would intervene, and you could just rinse and repeat for the next news cycle, the next university campus. And in some cases, students were inviting these individuals, but in others, there was some targeting happening of higher education. And in these moments, when these tensions flared, media accounts and university statements often framed these conflicts as conflicts over free speech. That was the sort of dominant narrative. And one particularly noteworthy example of this that inspired a lot of my own thinking on this topic are the events that happened at Middlebury College when a registered student organization invited Charles Murray, who is associated with the American Enterprise Institute, to speak on campus. In advance of his speaking, students protested. They viewed him as an unsuitable speaker for Middlebury, and there were protests on the day of. They shouted him down, and this particular moment is one that became a flashpoint. And not only did major newspapers pick up this case, but the faculty released a pretty detailed statement about their position on this case. And the students released a statement, and even national academics, even Cornell West and others jumped on board and put together their own statement about moments like these. And so this really became a flashpoint, and I got interested in writing about this case because it's one of those rare moments where there's video, there are multiple perspectives published. It's a really fascinating case to kind of dive into. And I liked it so much that I thought about it three different ways. The first way that I began thinking about this case is that working with my colleague and collaborator, Rebecca Taylor, I began wondering what intellectual virtues might be salient or for this type of a case. And as Rebecca and I continued to talk about the case and read the statements, we really sort of zeroed in on intellectual fairness. And we wondered, what would intellectual fairness demand of us in moments like these? And the first thing we kind of set out to do was to articulate for ourselves what intellectual fairness meant. And this is, I've included on the slide our full definition. I won't read it verbatim to you, but one of the things that we recognize is that intellectual fairness had demands to make of us when it came to the content of what was being said by the controversial speaker and by the protesters, and then also the actual people themselves. So we recognized that one thing intellectual fairness would challenge us to do is to critically assess the intellectual credibility of the statements one was making, to look inward and to combat negative and positive biases towards particular ideas or particular groups that we might have. And then in educational settings, one thing that's very important to me is to recognize that everyone around us in an educational setting, hopefully they are on their own journey for intellectual development. And part of our role as educators is to respectfully support this development. We do have to protect other students from harm, but at the same time, we have to recognize that everyone around us, including ourselves, are all works in progress. After thinking about the case that way, I sat down and I was still not quite satisfied. And you know how a problem is just, it kind of runs over in your mind and you just keep toying with it. Well, so in another paper in Philosophy and Theory in Higher Education, I sat down with the case again and I thought, well, what if we reframed moments like these as moral disagreements over contested values, drawing from the work of Michelle Moses? And in this particular case, what I saw and read was that faculty were saying that free speech is an incredibly important value and that deliberative democracy is essential. They were repeating their assumptions and claims that it's only through the contestation of ideas and the clashing of different viewpoints that we preserve democracy. On the other hand, students were also making moral claims. The claims they were making were on the topic of justice and inclusion. And they were saying that actually ideas, the best ideas don't always rise to the top. That this idea that all ideas should be debated vigorously in a democracy, they wanted to call attention to the ways in which some ideas have justice-related impacts on individuals. And they were expressing a real sense in which they didn't believe that they could trust that over time the best ideas would rise to the top. And so at first I kind of looked at, well, what are the values that each side is really emphasizing? And then I thought, are they just talking past one another? Or because that happens so much, right? When we have conflicts and crises on campus, we're not even having the same conversation. So I wondered if maybe these events could be better described as a moral disagreement over knowledge seeking and the university's role as a producer and a disseminator of knowledge. And I won't go into the full argument here, but in the paper, I start to tease out, free speech and deliberative democracy, they have made certain contributions to producing and disseminating knowledge, which is a core function of any college campus. But at the same time, what we know from empirical research is that knowers are flawed. We are susceptible to being swayed by the appearance of prestige. Someone like Charles Murray with the American Enterprise Institute, what a fancy organization. He must be a super credible speaker because Middlebury has allowed him to come. Those things are, students were raising those claims, and they're not divorced from the empirical literature. There are ways in which the empirical literature has some helpful insight for us there. So if we think about knowers as they actually are and not as we wish them to be, then maybe what we see here is a moral disagreement over knowledge seeking and this core function of the university. And maybe that would be a place to start having some of these conversations. So very quickly, thinking three ways, in the third sort of iteration of my thinking about these moments, in a book on ethics in higher education, we created a hypothetical case, including a controversial speaker and conflict on campus. And one of the things that we did with that case is after writing this fictional case, we invited 6 different experts to weigh in on how they would respond to the ethical issues raised in a moment like this on a college campus. I'm only going to mention a couple of the insights here. One is that Laura Schwartz, I think she really informed my own perspective in that she helped me understand that in secondary settings, high schools have a lot of control over who is speaking, who is wearing what. They're coming in, they see educators as people who can control their dress code, who can control their curriculum. And so the post-secondary setting can be very confusing, right? There might be some hurt and anger if the university says like, well, we can't prohibit that person's free speech. Well, what do you mean you can't? And how is that different? And then Janine Denovius really helped us think about cultivating brave communities in moments like these. I say all of that because it informs my last 2 slides, which are about the missed opportunities for educating character across differences. When these tensions arise on college campuses, and we are seeing them every day in the news, and they are on the hearts and minds of our faculty, staff, and students, we often witness leaders either retreat or retrench. And so what we see our objective is we just want to survive the news cycle until the crisis dissipates. But what if instead these were moments that were missed opportunities for educating character? What if they weren't moments of retreat, but moments for exercising courage? And what if they weren't moments of retrenching into our previously held positions, but to practicing open-mindedness and engagement with one another ideas? And so in my own work at Florida International University, when I encounter tension on campus or tension in my classroom, I ask myself, is there an underlying moral disagreement that I'm not seeing? Are we having the same conversation, or are we talking past one another? This is an important one in my setting in FIU because I'm in Miami, which is also known as the capital of Latin America and the Caribbean. And I am not from that city initially. So to what extent are the different perspectives products of different histories and lack of understanding of those histories? And then are we lost in translation, literally or figuratively? Again, this is kind of a context-specific thing, but I think it's applicable in other areas. Oftentimes we are failing to communicate to one another the real core intent of what we're concerned about. And when all else fails, I remind myself that I am not the person today that I was when I was in college or grad school. We are all works in progress. And going back to that point about intellectual fairness, we may disagree vehemently today and preserve the possibility of agreement in the future, or if not agreement, respect and collaboration. So that's what I'm going to leave you with for now. I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ashley. We're going to turn it over now to Chrystal Johnson. And again, I encourage you, if you have questions specifically on what Ashley spoke about, please drop them in the chat now so that we can be ready for questions when all three of our speakers have concluded.
Good afternoon. So it's great to hear Ashley's presentation talking about these missed opportunities and acknowledging that when it comes to educating for character across differences, that sometimes we don't always recognize the differences in how we experience character based on our historicity and our cultural aspects and even our linguistic differences and where we come from. And so what I'm going to talk about today is this notion of culturally consonant character development, which has been the guiding, the lodestar of my research over the course of these last 19 years, and where I've kind of looked at how pretty much K-12 teachers have experienced character development in their classrooms and how that has influenced student behavior, whether it's civic engagement, civic discussions, social responsibility, things of that nature. But I want to kind of step back and also address this notion of inquiry across the P12 arc of education, or actually not even so much P12, but P16. So going all the way from elementary schools up to higher ed institutions. We often don't think that writing good questions or developing that inquiry arc is it's supposed to be easy for us as educators. And it's often not. And it really is in the framing. And if we're going to really elicit this notion of difference and being able to recognize difference when it comes to character development and allowing different perspectives to be put forward by others in the classroom, we have to create or construct good questions. So I'm just going to kind of talk about what does that look like, what does it mean, and kind of give you some highlights about how to do it when you think about it. So when we think about culturally consonant character development, we're looking at this notion of culture and how culture guides students' moral and character processes. And it's Charles Mills who famously talked about this notion of the moralities of exclusion, which I've written about, where as the social contract was being drafted, predominantly by white males over 400 years ago, that there was this emphasis on creating the other. And so you had to create the other in several realms. And one of the realms was the moral realm. We had to say that if you were not white, a person of color, from a primarily female included, that your idea of morality was antithetical to what the dominant majoritarian perspectives were. And what that has set up is this notion of creating this sense of how marginalized populations think about character, think about what it means to be good, what does it mean to be moral and virtuous, is outside the realm of what is recognized as being good, virtuous, and noble. And so what I wanted to kind of think about and what folks to really consider is that we have to allow these spaces and these different perspectives to percolate across our classrooms, these discussions percolate across our classrooms. And so we want to be able to promote this inclusivity and this relevancy when perspectives that maybe we don't necessarily feel comfortable accepting do find their way in our classroom discussions. The importance of considering culture and character development, it enhances a student's sense of identity and belonging. What we do know from the research is that from adolescence, which can include anywhere from about 10 all the way up to about 25, we do see this sense of identity development in youth. And it's really important that we give them the space to clarify their more perspectives. What is it? What do they feel it means to be virtuous and moral, and allow them space to kind of consider other alternatives, to interact with different opinions. It does foster this sense of respect and appreciation for others and for diversity. And all too often, and I think my colleague said it in her presentation prior to mine, is that what we are seeing is this tension where we're coming to this logjam where different opinions cannot be shared thoughtfully, constructively, and there cannot be a counter response to those thoughtful discussions or thoughtful presentations. That everything becomes one of this shouting match. I think back to a program, some of you may remember this from the late 1990s, Point Counterpoint, where it was just shouting back and forth, and then that became the precursor to what we now see across much of the news media today, even and it has obviously affected our politics to the point where there's limited discussion and deliberation going on, which is so vital to a democratic society. It also improves student engagement and motivation. We are looking at this notion of civic motivation and civic purpose. And if we don't allow students the opportunity to practice, to become engaged, to develop their sense of not only who they are, their identity, but their civic awareness and civic identity and social responsibility, that it then kind of can hamper their motivation to do those just things, to work in their community, to engage with others. And we want to make sure that that is being fostered and supported. You know, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, we live in a multicultural, diverse world, and we have to learn to respect different opinions, different people, different backgrounds, and understand that, as James Baldwin once said, it is our history that is guiding who we are and where we're going, and we've got to acknowledge that history, warts and all, as decisions are made and we move forward. And then I think the thing that it's really important too is about strengthening our communication. You know, all too often you are reading current reports that the current generation, Gen Z, is having trouble expressing themselves, being able to communicate effectively when it comes to dynamic topics or moral topics in classrooms or on campuses. And again, it goes back to this idea of learning how to deliberatively debate and talk about in discussions ways that we're different and how we can come to some type of common goal for the common good. One thing that we have to think about, not just as you know, we're all teachers in some way, shape, or form, whether we are in higher ed or we are in a secondary or an elementary school. We're teachers to the core of who we are. And inquiry plays an important tool in how we help to push culturally consonant character with our students and help them to be able to express and identify who they are and grapple with key questions that are continuously come up throughout our society. And so when we think about inquiry as this tool with culturally consonant character development, we're looking at encouraging exploration of cultural values and traditions, not shying away from that. This is not, we're not calling for any type of banning, censoring. This is putting everything that we know about ourselves and who we are and what we've come to be at the forefront. You know, unfortunately, we are in this stage, this tension right now in society where some of that is being challenged, but that does not allow for growth. Tension drives growth. And as we are maturing as a multicultural democratic society, we have got to learn to have those discussions across difference. It also helps to promote critical thinking and understand this notion of cultural norms and ethics, that your way of seeing things is different from how I see it. It doesn't make me better or you better, me right or you wrong. It's just this notion of, again, our historicity, our culture is driving how we see and interact with our world and how we interact with others in our world. It does help to facilitate discussion on cultural identity and experiences. Research is telling us how much cultural identity, particularly racial identity, does play in how we see ourselves as far as motivating our civic purpose, our civic engagement, or just our sense of social responsibility. A work that a colleague and I did a few years ago where we challenged, we had a teacher, middle school teacher, excuse me, implement a particular curriculum. And then we wanted to see how this changed students' ideas of their racialized self and then their propensity to go out into their community and engage. So that notion of civic identity and civic beliefs and motivation. And what we noticed is that when their racialized identity trended to the positive, when they positively saw themselves, their racialized self, they had a sense for wanting to go out and become engaged, not just in their particular racial community, but just within the larger community as well. They saw the sense of, I can do this. I know who I am. I'm confident in who I am. And so therefore I can go out and engage my community and deliver on some of those social responsibilities that are so key to a democratic society. And then, you know, we want to make sure that students are also connected, that they're grounded in their cultural backgrounds, and that they understand there is a moral sense of who they are culturally that is guiding their communities and their place in society. So when we are thinking about inquiry in culturally consonant character development, it's about writing good questions. And I go back to the statement that I made earlier that sometimes we think as teachers, we know, whether we're higher ed faculty or our high school faculty, we know how to write good questions. And what research and education tells us is that many of us across the spectrum don't know how to write good questions when it comes to getting our students to think at a higher level about really abstract concepts such as justice or democracy, things of that liberty, things of that nature. And so we want to make sure that we are crafting good, some research calls them essential questions. Others may call them compelling questions. So we want to be able to write good, open-ended questions that encourage elaboration and exploration. There's no right or wrong, that we are putting the question out there to see how our students can respond, inviting them to respond to the question. They have to be relevant, relating back to students' lives and their real world. So to say, you know, to ask a question about something that does not have any relevancy to this particular generation that we are focusing on within higher ed right now, you know, there might be similarities to students from 20 or 30 or 40 years ago in some regards, but this is a different time, a different place. And so it has to be relevant to their world. They should be challenging, addressing complex ideas and multiple perspectives. In the social studies, when we're helping, as a teacher educator, when I'm helping teachers to see how to craft questions in social studies, we would say, well, what are those big ideas? What are those enduring ideas that we continue in this democracy to stumble over? We just can't answer. We keep asking the same question. We keep talking about the same thing. This notion of liberty. We've been discussing this big idea of liberty for almost, you know, 300, 400 years now, and we still are tinkering towards some type of utopia around that big idea, but it becomes one of where we can continuously use that big idea to craft an open-ended question that relates to the particular time that we're in, and therefore can draw in the interest of our students. We want the question to be reflective. We want students to have this sense of self-reflection. It shouldn't just be about what do you think, you know, or what do I think about this topic. We want them to be able to develop their own self-awareness, whether they're seeing it from another perspective or being able to grapple with how they deal with maybe the difference, the uneasiness about the topic. And so you always want to allow that self-reflection to really be at an embedded component of the question as well. And this notion of cultural sensitivity. So being able to recognize that we're all going to bring a different perspective to that answer to the broad, open-ended question. And because there's no right or wrong, we have to allow space for these conversations to happen. How you set that up in your particular setting should always encourage folks to feel comfortable, supported, and confident that their voices can be heard and honored in that space. So those are just kind of some simple ways to set up these good inquiry questions. I don't want to take too much time about how to write them. That's a typical workshop that I give teachers over the summer. But this does allow us to see that we all can help, use some help in better crafting questions that will get to helping to support our students' culturally consonant character development and be able to educate for character across differences. And I look forward to your questions later on the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chrystal. And your question about how to prepare teachers and faculty members to do this, I'm sure is a burning question for all of us. So the fact that you're saying that you're doing that right now in a summer program, I'm sure there will be many questions about that. I'm now going to turn it over. So thank you to our last panelist, and Robyn Ilten-Gee.
Great, thank you. I will just. Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm really excited to build on what Ashley and Chrystal have already established in terms of educating character in the university context. I'm going to kind of really zoom into the classroom activity level. And I'd first like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam First Nations. This is an area known now as Vancouver, Canada. And this is an important practice that settlers here have been invited to take up as we unlearn colonial narratives. So when I think about character, I conceptualize several different systems working kind of dynamically together. And one of these systems that I really focus on is our capacity for reasoning and discourse, things that Ashley and Chrystal have already been talking about. What allows us to communicate and be in community with others across social and identity differences. And I like to think about, what orientations do we need to foster? What skills can we cultivate to help us engage in civic and moral discourse with each other, ultimately in the project of working towards justice and equity? And so today I'm going to share just a little bit from an ongoing research project that I'm doing in collaboration with my colleague here at Simon Fraser, Isabelle Cote, where we studied our own practice as university instructors to examine how a critical discussion assignment was able to facilitate authentic discourse amongst students. And so this assignment, it's called a critical discussion, and I'm going to share about it, the details with you today, but this was developed by Dr. Cote in the French language teaching context. Last year, both of us used this assignment in an undergraduate course called Introduction to Social Justice Issues in Education. And the text shown here is the course text that we both used. And this course, just for context, is a breadth course. So it's designed for anyone, any undergrad in the university. Often it's people who've never encountered these themes before. And this text is really introductory. So it offers definitions of, what is oppression, what is discrimination, what is prejudice, et cetera. And both of us assigned this project called the critical discussion. So I'm going to tell you kind of what it entails. So the first thing is that you provide a prompt ahead of time. So for example, it could be, as you see here, this is an example. In critical discussion 1, you're going to discuss your understanding of socialization, an experience you've had with an aspect of socialization, and then a critical reflection on that experience. So students know that ahead of time, and socialization is one of the chapters in this course text. So on the day of the assignment, they come in and they're assigned to a random group of 3. And then they audio record a 20-minute conversation where they attempt to answer this prompt together. And then afterwards, they complete a self-assessment. So this means each one of them has to listen back to the 20-minute recorded conversation and complete a self-assessment reflecting on their own participation and elaborating on the ideas that they shared. And I'm actually going to go ahead and share or just show you quickly the rubric that we use, just so you can get a sense of what this self-assessment entails. So the idea is that, this, after they engage in 20 minutes with their peers, they listen back through. And as they listen through, they actually provide timestamps and say, at 3 minutes, 30 seconds, I provided an example of socialization. So that would go in this proof column. And, in this second column here are the criteria. So you could have whatever criteria you would like to assess on. But the nice thing about this is it offers a chance for students to say, at 5 minutes, 17 seconds, I provided a definition of socialization, but I didn't quite get it all out. What I would add is X, Y, and Z. Mm. The other reason I love this self-assessment is that, as you can see here, most of these criteria are content-based, but we also ask them to provide evidence and proof of when they invited their peers into the conversation, when they asked a really good question, or when they were able to answer a question. So more meta elements of collaborative, as Ashley and Chrystal were saying, deliberation, when you really talk to each other instead of around each other. Can they identify when listening back when that happened? And that's when they would put in this proof column. Okay, so I'm just going to sit back over here to this. So I have to say, so this assignment was revolutionary for me. What you, as an instructor, you ask students to turn in the audio file as well as the written self-assessment. So I was listening through these 20-minute conversations where you're really hearing students without, you there as the instructor. They're much more candid, and you hear these genuine moments of surprise and spontaneity, and they are making mistakes. They're making assumptions. They're offering definitions that don't quite, match the text, or really finding ways to surprise you. And it was so clear where the misunderstandings were that I could go back and teach the next day and address them directly. I also think with the self-assessment, in the course, we say, what we're actually grading is the self-assessment. Turn in the audio file, that's a necessary component. But what I'm grading is your ability to reflect back on your own participation. And so I think this lifted a bit of pressure. When you're talking about things like racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia for the first time, it can be daunting. And so we are really interested not in them saying the right thing, but in how they reflected back on what they did say, because we all make mistakes, and that's one of the big points of this assessment. So how could this assignment be taken even further to foster character and moral and civic discourse skills, and specifically to take into consideration some of the culturally consonant ideas that Chrystal was mentioning? We do have to be aware that not everybody, coming into a conversation is coming from the same lived experiences. When we randomly assign students into groups, they're bringing different amounts of privilege, different lived experience with oppression or harm, different social capital, et cetera. And so harm could actually be done in those groups and in those conversations. So it was really important for us to, ahead of time, present guidelines. And I was kind of thinking of Ashley's, intellectual fairness. So we presented, actually this text presents 5 guidelines, for engaging with social justice issues. So intellectual humility is one of them, questioning our assumptions. Is this an anecdote? Is this fact? Is this opinion, et cetera? So really presenting those guidelines ahead of time to minimize the harm. But what I was going to suggest is that before you even have the critical discussion in class, you could consider, or have students consider, who might feel self-conscious in this conversation? Who might feel fearful? Who might feel marginalized? And why is that? So we get it on the table that, okay, we're going to be talking about sexism. So if we have a peer who's been a victim of, say, some kind of sexist encounter, they might feel, a bit targeted, and how could we create an inclusive environment to talk about that? After the critical discussion, we could even come back into those groups and discuss, what did you hear? What did I hear? How was it different? How did our identities, interact with this conversation? And what could we do differently next time? Okay, and then one just kind of interesting finding, we're currently in the process of analyzing a bunch of this critical discussion data, is that we noticed that students were frequently compromising juicy disagreement for what they called flow. So these comments came from our data. So we had somebody say in their self-assessment, throughout the whole discussion, all three of us made comments and showed that we were continuously engaged by responding in agreement or approval. Somebody else said, through all the discussion, I tried to agree with my classmates as well as compliment what they were talking about to develop a deeper conversation, which to me really sounds like a paradox, right? If you're just complimenting them and agreeing with them, are you really getting any deeper? And so these comments were quite revealing and came out of the self-assessment and critical discussion process. I would, if I had known that this is what students were anticipating, I might have preempted it by saying, can disagreement be a measure of success? What could that mean for us? So once again, the critical discussion gave me a chance to kind of reteach or revisit, bigger concepts as a whole community. So I think that's kind of just my really quick, brief takeaway from this one example. But I really look forward to your thoughts and conversations about our big picture issues here. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Robyn, and thank you to all of our panelists. I know we already have some great questions, but before we get to our questions from folks who are online, I would love to just ask you all if you have questions for one another, or if there are aspects of each other's presentations that you would like to comment on or draw a focus to for our listeners. Well, I'm going to follow in the footsteps of Jennifer Rothschild, who is usually hosting these panels. And Robyn, one of the things you said at the end of your presentation is that one of the things you would like to say to your students is, or ask your students, would the conflict or would the disagreement add to the growth or add to the program? Can I ask that question of you, and how you might have framed that had you known that that was going to come from the data?
Oh yeah, it's a great question, and it's something I'm still thinking about. So if other people have thoughts, I'd love to hear them. I think something that came out of the self-assessments, all of these meta elements, like how do you let other people know that you're listening? How do you let other people know that you want to include them in the conversation? So I saw students saying, at 5 minutes 11, I asked so-and-so a question because, she was silent the whole time and she didn't feel included. So like they are engaging in these skills that are completely different from, say, the skills on the syllabus. So this was really interesting to me. And I think I would have preempted the whole assignment by, I'm not sure what I would have done, but engaging them in some kind of conversation about, what does success, what does a really good, deep, critical conversation look like or sound like? And maybe I would have looked for some examples of really rich models. And that's something that maybe I was thinking about during Ashley's talk, is that I feel like we don't have any models of people showing us how to have these conversations publicly so that we can look to them as aspirational.
Thank you for that. Chrystal or Ashley, would you like to weigh in before we go to the other conversations, other questions?
I'll just weigh in and say that I've been thinking, listening to everyone, we have discussed discussion a lot. We have talked about talking a lot. And one thing that I don't want to de-emphasize is that I'm actually, my own personal opinion is that I'm actually not convinced that we can place upon the shoulders of deliberative debate and discussion all of democracy. I don't think democracy can hang on discussion. I think actually it's not just about talking, but about living lives in relation to one another. So I think there are ways in which it maybe because we're academics and we live in academic spaces, we default first to, well, how can we just get people to talk to one another better? But I'm also interested in like, I'm of the Mr. Rogers generation. How can we get people to live with one another better? How can we get them to be of service to their neighbor, even if they don't actually have things in common with their neighbor? So I love discussion and I love this thing, but I just also want to make space for we can't put everything on the shoulders of discussion because so much of our lives are lived in actions with one another in real time and real space and not in our conversations.
But it's to deliberative discussion that actions must grow. And I
Mm-hmm.
think we have to be cognizant of the fact, one, that as faculty, we have to model these behaviors of our students. We cannot assume that students will come to us knowing how to not only just discuss in a deliberative fashion, but also how to engage and interact with their peers in the classroom and within their cohort of students within their college or dorm or wherever they might be, and just in the larger community. So we have to be that type of model citizen, I'm going to use that word, that we can demonstrate to them how this works. And oftentimes, we're all guilty of it as faculty, that we are just trying to cover a particular topic or skill for that session or that week in the syllabus. And we're forgetting the larger sense of who we are and our purpose, which is to model these behaviors to the generations coming behind us. And so I think, I'm going to be the one that I do believe that deliberative discussion is central to any type of society. We've got to learn how to have these discussions in a way that facilitates change. What that change looks like can ebb and flow given the period that we're in. But it also should be that catalyst to get folks, when I say folks, I'm sorry, youth, I might say kids sometimes because I feel older now, but to get college students active in living out the principles that we would like, the democratic principles that we would like them to live out in their communities, and just be that change agent that we so want them to be as they move forward.
So that leads us actually to a question that was asked. Chrystal, the question was, what practices, if any, are you teaching or engaging in that enable these critical conversations? I think, Chrystal, you just specifically talked about modeling these behaviors. To you and to others on the panel, are there any other very specific practices that you would suggest to our to the folks online today that you use as you're helping students to engage in these critical conversations?
Well, I think like really this critical discussion assignment, I'm integrating it into every course that I possibly can. And the topic is going to be different. The prompt will be different. Maybe the purpose will be different, but like completely revising my understanding of what assessment really is. Can we assess students' reflections on their own learning instead of a product is kind of a revelation to me, and I think it allows students to practice like that reflexive skill. Maybe they even practice their own identity awareness, their cultural competence, their all of these things in those kinds of assessments. And it's using oral assignments as well in this way gives people a chance to practice social interaction. It gets away from, relying on ChatGPT and other, tools that instructors are really afraid of. You can't really, if you're watching them have the conversation, you say, that's what matters to me. That's what I want you to hear you reflect on. That's, that's kind of, I guess I'm like this idea is very central in my mind right now. So it's hard for me to think of other practices that speak so clearly to the idea of character. So.
But I think your idea, Robyn, about assessment, we understand that assessment, there's multiple types of assessment and multiple ways to use assessment to help facilitate learning within our classrooms. This notion, we don't always recognize the value of self-assessment or a reflective assessment with our students. We see that as being something that they do at the end of the course and not necessarily attached to a particular assignment. So you're not grading, as Robyn said, the product per se, but you're looking for growth in how students see themselves and identify themselves with the particular skills that you have attached or aligned with the assignment or product that you may grade or whatever you might choose to do with that particular assessment. So.
And I think I'd just add that the summer I've invited all the doctoral students in our department to join me in a book club of teaching with compassion. And I am hopeful that that will be a space that we can have some very intentional conversations around, preparing them to go into the classroom and be educators, be professors, because as we all know, nothing about our doctoral training for most of us prepares us to be these sorts of educators of character who engage with our students deeply and model the sorts of behaviors we want to see from them. So this is just one small bucket thing, but just an opportunity to kind of like engage where I can with the students that I have and hear from them and talk with them about, some of these topics in a more intimate setting.
Thank you to all of you for those answers. And I think it leads to another question that we have, which was, is it possible to educate character without attending to the power analysis or differentials? Or would you say that that must be central to the effort?
I'll just, go for it.
No, yes, I think it has to be central. Yes.
I agree.
Go ahead, Robyn.
I know I was just going to say I agree. I mean, the way I think about character is comes from a particular perspective where character represents kind of not necessarily like traits that we have all the time, but, actions that we do, or, how do we enact character in particular situations or particular contexts. And so these reasoning skills or these discourse skills are so important to that aspect of character, and just recognizing that we don't all enter a room with the same amount of power, and history, as Chrystal was saying. So I think it is central.
I think it's central also in like one of the things that I explored in the philosophy and theory paper is like there is a whole body of literature around the rules of deliberative democracy and engagement in what people term civil discourse. Like people have certain normative standards in mind when they use those terms. And I actually don't think that I endorse all of those. When I was young, I recall making very impassioned statements in class or encountering something that like I had a very emotional response to and I didn't know what to do with it. And I never want to create an environment in which students don't feel that there is room for them to grow into expressing themselves. An emotional response is a response. One of the things that my students have taught me is when we are discussing something particularly heavy, like in a history course when we were working through the civil rights movement, one of my students said, hey, you know what would have been really helpful for me is if you had invited us to engage in personal reflection first of what we just watched. We were watching part of Eyes on the Prize, and this student had never learned that history, and it was very impactful for them in that moment. And I recognize that I didn't structure that correctly. That assignment, like that conversation would have been better. And now I do that. I say, okay, I want you to take a few minutes for personal reflection on your emotional response to this, if you're having one. And only then am I going to invite you to talk about that with other people for whom you may feel there are power differentials kind of working against your unique position, right? So I think we have to listen to our students, and I think we have to respect again that they are all growing and learning, and leave space for them to not violate those rules, but just set those aside. If those are ideals we have in mind, no one is ideal. Our students aren't ideal. So be with our students as they are becoming, not holding them to standards they have not yet achieved. We're educating them.
I think we have time probably for one, maybe two more questions. One that we had was, how might a stress on curiosity and humility be helpful in guiding students for how to respond to speakers they think have an intense or an incompatible disagreement with? The person who asked this question used the Charles Murray example, but I think each of you have talked about in classes where there may be disagreements or this movement from disagreement to discussion. So I was wondering if you have thoughts about, again, curiosity and humility and the role they may play in these conversations or in these disagreements.
I'm happy to jump in first since the Murray thing was mentioned. I do think that curiosity and humility will carry you far. But I also think it's really important to consider moments where you need to be the person that is thinking about your own intellectual humility in that moment. What is controversial to you may be a matter of grave personal importance to someone else. So in the fictional case that we created, the speaker was talking about immigration policy, and some of the students protesting were people whose lives had been subjected to familial separation due to the policy the person was describing. So I think intellectual humility also, I think it's informative for everyone in that context, right? But I think that it's really helpful to sit down and think, like, part of intellectual humility is, I might find this interesting. I might find this an academic topic that is, an open topic, but for someone else, it's embodied and lived in a very different way. And I've got to keep that in mind as I engage with them. So that'd be my first response.
Chrystal or Robyn, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I was just I was thinking of when I was a doctoral student, there was an example. This is not going to be well crafted but the founder of Teach for America was invited to speak at our School of Education, who has become a controversial figure, as many of you, I'm sure, are aware. But I'm more thinking about, just how it was handled by the administration. And I guess, there are so many nuances. Like, there are differences between kinds of controversial speakers. Some are really just kind of spewing these hateful messages that maybe, but others might be, I'm not sure how you draw the line here, but intellectual controversial figures. But if, they ended up not coming to speak because there was a lot of protest and backlash from the community. But I am kind of curious how it could have been handled differently. For example, if the dean of our School of Education had said, well, this is what I'm curious about. So, engaging in curiosity. I'm curious about, how this view of yours can live alongside this data, for example, or, and maybe even had like a recorded pre-conversation with the speaker that then they asked, the community to watch and said, we're inviting this person to have a follow-up with us on campus because this is what I'm still curious about. I'm curious how curiosity can be integrated. So that also goes to what Chrystal was saying about modeling the behaviors. Like, could this be, in a different way?
Thank you. Chrystal, we have time for one more comment if you'd like to close us out.
So thinking about curiosity and humility, that they are character traits, and that these are something that we want folks to understand, that it is, we want to encourage you to have that curiosity, that, you know, I'm curious as to why you have this particular point of view, or where you're coming from in this particular piece that you've published, or the comments that you've made in your discussion. I mean, the question can go back to the example from Ashley about Charles Murray. Why do you think scientifically that Black people are intellectually inferior to white people based off of your science? And, you know, you can go a little bit deeper and look at some of the quantitative analysis that he did and say, that doesn't jive with some of the other hierarchical models that you can use to look at those. So you're going back into regression if you want to be a quant nerd. But anyway, different story. But I think it's something that when we talk about character traits, we don't often think about curiosity or humility. And I don't know everything. I don't know all that there is under the sun. And I'm willing to hear you out and listen to what you have to say. But I do offer and hope that you will be able to respond to what I have to say and hear what I have to say as well. So I think that is something that is, you know, addressing it in this age of, you know, controversy, where we're inviting certain speakers to campus. I know we've had some issues here at Purdue with that to some degree. You know, that we can be intellectually curious about a person's topic or their perspective, or where they're coming from. It's normal. It's just something that we should value as character traits, and that we should be humble enough to accept that maybe we haven't been exposed to everything, and we can also ask more questions about the topic as well. So,
well, on that note, thank you to all three of our panelists for being here today, for sharing both their work and their wisdom with us. And I thank everyone who has joined us today for giving us part of your time. We look forward to seeing you again in autumn when we start these up again. And hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the week. So thank you very much. And this will conclude our panel today.